Thank you so much for coming to this panel on embodiment in psychology. I'm your host, Scott Lyons, and I'm so grateful and excited to bring in my friends and colleagues and introduce them. Dr. Christine Caldwell, Professor Emeritus in the Somatic Counseling Program at Naropa University, author and founder of the Moving Cycle Institute. Pioneer Don Johnson. Don Johnson is the author of several books, including Diverse Bodies, Diverse Practices, articles and collections he's also written on various dimensions of bodily experience. He's also professor in the new doctoral program at CIIS in somatics. And my friend, Dr. Albert Wong, welcome, is a licensed psychologist and somatic educator with a long-standing interest in the intersection of embodiment, trauma, and scalable technology. He served as residential staff at the Hanlon Institute for several years and is the founder of the online education platform Somatopia. Thank you all so much for being here. So I want to just begin by acknowledging that each of you has made such a significant contribution in the field of embodied psychology. And so I'm really excited to have you all here together to talk, to share about your own journey and process and understanding of embodied psychology. So I'd like to get it started with just the question, what really excites you about embodied psychology? And what's your leading edge contribution? So what has been something meaningful and inspirational to you in your evolution in making this embodied psychology in evolution?
To me, central idea of somatics. And I particularly, over the last 10 years, have gotten very interested in micro movements. And so the contribution of the really tiny, almost metabolic movements of the body and how we can work with those very consciously in a psychotherapeutic context, not just a medical context, but a psychotherapeutic and social context. And so I get interested in movement on that broad continuum from all the way from micro movements to large, expressive, socially mediated movements, but also the diversity work.
Nice going, Christine.
Nice going on your part as well. Oh my goodness.
I love that. And I think that, Christine, thank you for naming that. I think that's been, we've had there's a conversation that's available at any time for people to watch on embodied social justice. And I think there was a really important piece there that was saying, often in the world of embodiment and somatic type work, there can be a lot of focus inward. Mm-hmm. And there has been, and that's so significant and important, like you're describing. And then it's essential that we also look at how does that apply to the social and community applications as well. Yeah. So thank you for naming that. Mm-hmm. I know that we'll probably dive more into that subject soon. I have a sneaking suspicion. So thank you for your contributions, Christine. It's been great. Albert, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. Well, I feel like I'm kind of a spring chicken on some level, just in terms of like the illustriousness and the history that really is here, right? I think, and just as you said, and I'll just echo it, kind of Don, you and Christine have been kind of foundational pillars, right, of bringing forward this movement when there were voices in the wilderness, right? Kind of, there's a way of like trying to dignify kind of this kind of Wild West field with academic respectability,
Well, Tibetan.
Yeah, right. It's and sometimes it's still hard to kind of ride the bucking bronco, but
Yeah.
You guys have been just steadfast with your kind of acumen, right? Your clarity, kind of your championing, and the tradition that I come from is the Esalen tradition, where it's nobody captures the flag. right? Which is like kind of in a field where, there's personalities, there's the need to create a living, there's kind of so much incentivization for kind of claiming the one and the only way and the truth. I see both of you, I mean, all of us, but in part because of the history, right? Kind of, I think all of us share this as a common thread, but kind of Don and Christine, you as early trendsetters in creating a space for collective inquiry, right? And kind of thinking about things in the broader perspective. So yeah, it's just, it's an honor to be here kind of on this panel, right? Trying to hold down the fort in my own way, right? With one of the big three, right? John F. Kennedy kind of in the somatics program. So, and there's always kind of shifts and changes, as the world turns. But, in terms of embodiment and my contribution, I'm new on the game, right? I contribute in the ways that I can. One of the things, and I'll agree with Christine, just in terms of just the notion of, and I was actually going to use that quote, from the margins to the center, right? Because we've gone from being kind of this kind of wacky, weird thing that people do, right? Like, what's that? To being, kind of, I think on some level, the leading, and it's gone from leading edge to almost in some fields, core curriculum, right? If you want to learn about trauma nowadays, it's like, okay, this is you got to do this. I mean, on some level of embodiment. So it's really kind of a different role and a different kind of evolutionary process. I think in the beginning, it's like, okay, kind of how do we not tear each other apart and kind of find our identity as a field? And now it's kind of, okay, now we, on some level, when The Body Keeps the Score is on the New York Times bestseller list, kind of like, I don't know, 6 years running, right? Like, we are in a different position. And so how do we kind of take this that we've got and then extend it, right? Taking it from kind of the wisdom of the body into like, okay, into different fields, and use it. I think Christine, you were getting at this, like, kind of, okay, not just the micro movements, but the broader movements, like the movement that's happening in the world, right? There's this notion of change happens from the bottom up, right? Change happens from the bottom up. And if you look at social change that's happening, it's happening from the bottom up, and kind of learning to use the technology and the wisdom of this field to create that kind of shift and change. And this conference itself being an example of that, right? Voices from all over Antarctica, and all the continents, right? Collectively coming together and shaping, I don't know, a new body, a new kind of organic whole that maybe can make a difference. So, I think all of these are super beautiful and exciting. And so it's just an honor to take a small place in line in this great lineage. Yeah.
I was wondering how long into you talking would people start to comment on the soothingness of your voice? I've been teaching with Albert for, well, I guess a year now or two. And it's always so fun to see people. Like, that's one of the first things they do. There's a tone, and I actually want to name that, because I think that's part of an embodiment practice, is that the tone of the voice is reflective of the inner regulation, the inner capacity to settle and find ease. And the idea of that, even as a therapist, that you yourself have an embodied experience, that your own ability to regulate, to process, might contribute to how someone else is experiencing their experience.
Let me just step in on that, because what you inspired me, Alice, to forget something, which is, I would say that my main focus in my teaching has been language, in the sense of how do we bring to words what we discovered when Christine and I got into this stuff. People were always saying, we can't talk about any of this stuff, it's too precious, which means we marginalize ourselves.
Yeah, right.
And one of the great insights right now for me, I mean, enormous insight, is I've had this weird life trajectory. So I had my first grandchild when I was 85 years old. And so I'm watching her grow up. And it's just fascinating. I mean, it's just overwhelmingly fascinating to see this movement from ee, oh, ah, oh, ah, la, 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 and gradually watching her attuning to our sounds without words. And then gradually, you can just see her. Tomorrow, she may say, she did say dada the other day to my son. And she's gradually beginning to form that. So to me, this task of keeping language moving in that current of experience and not getting cut off from it, which is the big problem we're having right now. I mean, one way of seeing a lot of problems we're having right now with disconnected language in the world. That's been a really big work of mine, of really letting, and Hanlon has been probably the best teacher of mine in that world, where he really, you know, he's created focusing to help people sit down and not say the words until they're ready to come out of the whole experience. You know. And so anyhow, you remind me of that, Al, because it's so hard to talk to people. You're so great to talk to.
No, oh, that's so kind. I mean, I'm so with you just in terms of kind of letting the words kind of retain their life, right? Let the word be a living word, not just kind of, because sometimes words land like thud, you know.
Too much lock out there. It's just like
yeah, right. Lock us down. Yeah. So.
In that sense, words are just kind of empty vessels waiting to be filled by our experience. And part of it is being able to tap into our experience so that the language can be mothered into expression.
Yeah.
I'd also
like
like
to sound, yeah.
I'd also like to put in a plug for body language and body narrative. So I think part of what all of us, particularly here on this panel, are also really interested in is the relationship of the nonverbal language systems to the verbal language systems, and how to create a kind of flow between wordless experience and wordful experience. And I think all of us have championed that you can't really have a wordful experience, a graceful wordful experience, if you can't hold and be with and care for your wordless experience. And the language of the body as your first language, before you even have verbal language, your body is your language, your moving body is your language system. And so to be able to connect those two elements, I think, is a critical part of what, particularly, I think it's not a mistake or an accident that you've invited a bunch of academics on this panel. We're all academics, tried and true to the bone, right? And so the quality of how particularly we can study experience, even wordless experience, is part of what we signed up for when we became body-centered people. And so wordless experience is kind of at that root of how we support wordful experience. So just wanted to add that puppy in there.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah,
just to add a tiny bit to that, I'm always struck when my son was born and when my granddaughter was born, my friends say, gee, it would be great when they get to the verbal stage. And I'm saying, well, no, I love it, right? I'm very happy with the stage.
Yeah.
It's so amazing. It's incredibly amazing to me.
Well, and Christina put it another way, I think, I mean, you describe it so well. And I think part of the process of this embodied psychology, or interchangeably, we could say somatics, or maybe we can talk about, are they different? But, you know, one of the things is returning to our native language, this universal native language of the body, of sensation, of breath, of movement, and to re-enter into and come back into the fullness of our innate language gives us more access to the fuller conversation that is actually happening within us and around us.
Yeah, just tagging on to that, I think that so much of what is problematic about our society is that we forgot how to go back into that wordless place, like of pure experience, and be kind of connected to just the raw feeling where it is, just like kind of the baby that's been born. It's like, hey, that doesn't look right. That's not okay. You know, and then like feeling that, letting our bodies feel that so that we can kind of then find the words. I think so much like when we're kind of just, Dawn, as you were describing, kind of the newborn child, right? In some ways, like kind of the tyranny of words can sometimes take over, right? And then we become just operationalized in a top only kind of environment where kind of we become disconnected from that kind of that process, that dialectic between wordlessness and wordfulness, right? Kind of we become disembodied rather than body full, right? And so kind of I think one of our kind of our challenges in the field and challenges of our society is how do we reconnect that, right? Rediscover the child, rediscover the body, rediscover the inside so that we're speaking from the inside out, not, and the bottom up, not just top to top to top. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the three of us have survived the most wordy culture. It's a hard work. I struggle with it every day. So we certainly got into the lion's den.
Amen to that.
I don't know. I know Christina and we both were dancers. And Albert, I don't know your background if you were dancers, maybe you were. But it is interesting that I think, you know, a lot of us who came from a very bodyful practice, such as somatics and movement therapy, then, you know, it was a natural transition into something in terms of psychology called embodied psychology or somatic psychology. And I actually want to see, for you, is there a difference between somatic and embodied psychology?
I just want to say, I'm always saying this to people, we're making it up as we go along. We are the people who are making up the words, so we can say whatever we want. First of all. Yeah. Secondly, I came to this before there was much formal psychology, psychoanalysis and behavioral psych. Those were the dominants. So I entered the field. I have my doctorate in philosophy and hung out, you know, was raised with Carl Rogers and all those people who are doing what now is kind of crystallized as clinical psychology, counseling psychology. But it was the Wild West in those days. So we were making it up as we went along. So to answer your key question, to me, there's a whole panoply of body practices, some of which lend themselves very easily to the counseling situation, other than which not so much. Like Rolfing is not a particularly easy thing to integrate into a psychotherapeutic mold. But it is easy to combine it. Like one of my friends who's a Rolfer is a no performer in Japan, and he totally integrates Rolfing within the theater experience and movement experience. So somatics to me is a much bigger umbrella of like meditation. I think the closest model parallel to somatics in my mind is meditation practices. We have a whole panoply of them, and some of them can be shuttled into the psychotherapy mode.
Yeah. And I know that for some of us coming into this call, the idea of embodied psychology or somatic psychology, but for now embodied psychology, is actually a new concept. So maybe we could take a few minutes just to orient kind of in a timeline or kind of position what has been more the traditional psychology, so from which most of us have sort of stemmed from, and then the transitionary process into something that's more embodied in terms of psychology.
Well, historically, it's a curious reality, because historically with Freud and Jung, they started out with the body. And then it became problematic because of sex in all those cases. So that's my little two-liner. So Freud's first paper was on a case of male hysteria where this guy dragged his leg, but it wasn't the anatomical leg. He started saying, So, so psychoanalysis started very, very much focused on body experience, and then drifted away because of power issues and political issues and sex issues. So a lot of its recovery of the late 19th century, and particularly after the 1918, after the World War, when trauma became such a big deal.
Dean Albert, do you want to add to that sort of positioning of sort of, I guess it's a really good point too, Don, that it's not just the classical ideas of psychology, but even like we could say the last 80 some years of psychology that break from the body into more analysis, and then the returning of the body.
Well, I think that one sort of very almost simplistic way to look at it is from the perspective of top down, bottom up. And and the idea of top down is the idea that you can think about and talk about your experience, which is a level of abstraction from it. And that there's kind of a trickle down economics there, that your thinking can influence you to get better. I'm going to make it in real simplistic terms. And so there's where Freud's talking cure came from. But Don's really correct. There was a lot of ways initially that Freud was very somatic. He, for instance, in the very beginning, used touch with his clients also. And he had people lie down on couches for a good reason, because he felt like it was he called it regression in the service of the ego, but blah, blah, blah. That's my academic talking. So, but there's this top-down quality of the idea that how I think about something can influence my ability to get better, more well-being. And there's a limitation to that. Certainly we can use thinking and speaking as a resource, but when we valorize it as the only resources or as the only doorway, we really miss a tremendous amount of experience. We miss anyone with addiction, anyone with profound mental illness like schizophrenia. We miss children, we miss people we just miss so many people and so many life experiences when we confine ourselves to just that one top-down resource. And so a lot of what we're pioneering is this idea of that bottom-up holding of direct experience, tracking the body's state, the body's movement, the body's processing or ongoing experiencing of itself is actually centrally relevant to our ability to work with our experience. And so Don was talking about, we really only had psychoanalysis was the talking cure. And then we had behaviorism, which was our first sort of more primitive attempt at a bottom-up process. Skinner and Watson and those people said, listen, doesn't matter what you think. It's all about what you do, right? It's all in behavior. And so that has certain limitations as well. And so, a lot of what Skinner eventually started to talk about became really sort of extreme, and the idea of what you do is the only thing. And so I think really what bodies do is bodies organically and constantly oscillate between top down and bottom up. We're always going, something's rising up from the physical experience, and then something is playing with that from the more cognitive experience. And that oscillation, that flow, cooperative, integrative flow between top down and bottom up is probably where we're headed. And it's very important that all of us sort of feel that our lives can be enriched both by what we do top down and by what we do bottom up. It's just that historically the bottom up has been marginalized, it's been suppressed, it's been made wrong, and it continues to be so now with different kinds of social oppression create a kind of bodilessness or a misembodiment that then really interferes with and distorts our ability to use bottom-up processes for our own well-being. And so that's, again, I'll stop there. Because us academics, we can talk for hours.
That was fabulous, Christine. That was really great. I just want to add one little piece. When Freud departed from the body, that's when analysis got interminable and out of reach of anybody. So there's something about coming back to body experience that makes it accessible. And you don't have to have 5 sessions on couch a week talking.
Right.
So the thing becomes more popularly available.
Yeah, really important point, Don.
To social justice work.
Yeah, no, I think all of these are really linked, right? Kind of. I mean, I think this. I sometimes think about just the way the field is moving into kind of like, I think a lot of, I don't know, like early stage somatics embodiment people were really just bottom up, like listen to the bottom, and then and now we're moving into a different phase, which is much more just like you were saying, Christine, about like how do we kind of integrate the both, right? Okay, now that we've gotten a little bit more airtime or play given to the body, how do we kind of have that dialogue between, bottom processes, top processes, and kind of connect them? I just like to, I don't know, one small point, like even before Freud, like with hypnosis, right? That was very like putting the hand on the forehead, all of these things very embodied even before Freud. And then I think I want to just say, I don't know, something that I think we should be cautionary of. And I think with Christine, kind of you kind of helped us kind of steer through it, that we should become careful about our own kind of somatic dogmatism, right? Like bottom up is the only way. Right? Yes. Because I think that is a challenge that has faced different kind of bodies of work historically, whether it was psychoanalysis that became like, oh, you have to join our institute, and we became like the only thing in town, which kind of other people couldn't get into. It became very exclusive, right? And then supplanted by the modern CBT paradigm, which now kind of, oh, we're evidence-based and therefore exclusive, right? And nothing else is of value. And we run the risk, right, in our field. And I understand sometimes when you're at the margins, you have to kind of shout loud and kind of like claim, but now that we're in a position, and I think increasingly so, right, to say, we're legit, right, to not kind of silo ourselves off or negate kind of the top, right, to be integrative of kind of bottom up, top down. And I would add also kind of different processes like inside out, outside in, right? Kind of past present, which I think, and present past, kind of that's the psychoanalytic channel. Like there's all these different kind of integrations, right? And I think, and just to hold the mic for a second longer, but I think that there's so many different kind of fields within psychology, like transpersonal psychology, which deals with the split between individual and then their sense of spirit, like, that's kind of where some of our challenge is when we're kind of cut off from our sense of higher connectedness with something, right? Or are being cut off from our creative capacity, right? So our expressive capacity, or, our connections with other people, and, relational capacities. And I think that each of these fields, like somatic psychology, integrates the body-mind split, right? Kind of transpersonal integrates the spirit kind of psyche split, right? Expressive arts integrates like when I'm cut off from my creativity. And that kind of one thing that somatics and embodied psychology, I hope, can do is kind of have a big tent and include like the big picture of integrating like all of these different ways in which we can get split off. So.
Oh, well put.
Nice, Robert.
Well put.
Cheers. Yeah, I think that's, is what supports this unique matrix in this moment, as opposed to saying there's only one map to embodiment or one map to healing or one map of personal growth. But what is the map that's being created for this unique individual in relation to everyone else and everything else?
Let me just build a tiny bit on that. Because of my age and my lifelong struggle with lungs, I feel I'm a prime target for the little monster that's running around the world right now. And so I can easily get hysterical with fear. Going outside, I think, oh, they're the modular globules floating around the atmosphere, they're going to kill me. And one of the things that's been so calming to me in the midst of all this atrocious political stuff is the scientists. I paid a lot of attention to the dialogue among the virologists and the public health people around the world. And they're just so moving to me. Like in Wuhan, the 2 hours after they discovered the virus, they were calling the United States and Europe and India and saying, we've got a new virus here. And then they're joining. So you have these thousands of lab scientists that are so on it. They're really on it. And I think it's a really good model for us to look at right now. And this is, Scott, why I really appreciate what you're doing, because it's that kind of creating this kind of instant dialogue about, well, what can we do about global warming as a community? What can we do about all this dogmatism that's running around? And there are a lot of really fabulous conversations if we have the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Wilhelm Reich says he has this idea of work democracy. He says if only we could just get together and focus on problems rather than great ideas, we'd be a lot better off.
And I'd love to talk a little bit, thank you, Don. It's a helpful positioning. And Albert, I want to come back to something you said, which is about splits. And this is an interesting, thing that, or something I'm interested in, is looking at sort of dualism versus non-dualism in psychology, and especially somatic psychology or embodied psychology, which is, so dualism would say, hey, the body affects the brain and the brain affects the body. That would be a dualism, saying it's like, hey, this affects this or this affects that, as opposed to saying this is all part of one global process and one emergent process that we could call consciousness, depending on our tradition, that we could call, I like to think about this also as the mind with a capital M, depending on how you want to language that word. But, and that would be more the non-dualism process, that's saying that everything is in conversation and communication, that as opposed to it's this or that. And so when we talk about healing the splits, in a non-dualistic language, we would say, well, the splits were never actually there. They're just obstructions in our feeling or our understanding of that interconnectivity of all of us, or of within ourselves. And so yes, there are these particular sects of psychology that focus on different ways of where obstruction happens from knowing from a first-person experience of our wholeness. And I want to name that because it's a particular thing that I think for me has been quite important to really identify the difference between kind of a dualism and a non-dualism. And non-dualism, especially coming from more of the non-dualistic yoga and philosophy, which has felt really, and for me, I mean, I'm a believer of, and academically so, that the origins of embodied psychology having such a clear position in that sort of non-dual tantric philosophy. And people who write about it is like Harish Wallace, Sally Kempton, who are scholars in that tradition, and then talk about this is not new, essentially coming into ourselves and experiencing and healing where there's obstructions of wholeness is actually thousands and thousands of years old. We're just sort of codifying it in this particular way here.
Well, yes, but.
And,
yes, exactly.
I just finished a doctoral dissertation, a fabulous dissertation, by a woman who did it on early Tantra.
Mm.
And the weight of her research work was ferreting out really old, around 9th century times when women had an equal role in the teaching that men did. And then it got totally subverted. So you have an extremely divisive tradition in the Tantra tradition. Actually, I have kind of, in my old age, have gotten more, not dualistic, but I see that there are so many dividing things, some of which are really important to get the church out of the way. Descartes made dualism so they couldn't put him in jail like they did Galileo. So I think the world of divisions is an important world to have a conversation about, and not to just say it's bad.
Yeah, didn't mean to say it was bad. I just wanted to differentiate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Don. I was going to go in the same direction because I think we want to create a situation in somatics where we don't have to privilege either dualism or non-dualism, that we're inclusive of both of those. And it's, I really appreciated Don's perspective, and I would like to sort of add in, particularly from the neuroscience perspective. So if you look at developmental neuroscience, you see that neurons in the fetus start out developing in isolation, relative isolation. So a neuron sort of hunkers down and says, okay, I'm going to be in the left hemisphere, and I'm going to be in the cerebral cortex, and I'm going to be this kind of neuron. I'm going to establish who I am, and I'm just going to hunker down and do that. And so neurons developmentally start out actually really establishing their identity, their kind of distinctiveness. Okay, I won't say separation, but I'll say distinctiveness. And then what happens next developmentally is they say, okay, I got it, and I'm going to swim towards and start talking to others. And so the next phase of brain development is actually neural integration. So once you've said, I've got it, I've felt my distinction, I now want to be in contact with as many other distinct entities, other neurons, glial cells, etc., as possible. And so we actually migrate and we oscillate from distinction to integration. And so it's actually, again, a flow state where there are times where, as Don was saying, we really have to feel our distinct identity. And we actually have to kind of pull in and say, you know, what's happening isn't right. You know, this is not right. I have to really actually work with creating a distinction from something that's going on that isn't right. You know, what's been happening in the States for 400 years isn't fucking right. And we have to really stand up to that. And part of that is to create distinctions. And so we, yeah. And so we want to also create integrations as well as distinctions, and our ability as clinicians, as well as activists, and as well as theoreticians, to understand how that flow works, and when adaptively we have to go more toward distinction, and when we have to go more toward integration. That's it. That's the subtlety, that's the richness, that's the complexity of what we've all signed up for.
Yeah. There was a question about that came up earlier about is dualism wrong? And I would say from the tantric tradition, and that, which is different for those of you who are familiar with neo-tantra, so this is not a sexual process. This is an older philosophy. That dualism is included in non-dualism, as Christina is talking about, that articulation is part of the reflection of integration and wholeness.
Francisco, did you ever see that short essay that Francisco Varela wrote years ago called "Not One, Not Two"?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a classic. Yeah. Varela really had it going on.
He really had it, yeah.
Great. So I'm just watching some of the questions come in, and for those of you who are, thank you so much for all your questions. I will try to capture some of them in the following discussion. But I would like to get to a conversation about, just to in reflection of Don's book, Diverse Bodies, Diverse Practices. And I would love to talk about what is the process of inclusion with somatics? How has it not been inclusive? And how is the process of this type of psychology or embodied psychology becoming, or had the opportunity to become, more inclusive and dynamic and diverse?
Well, for me, the answer is partly in that collection. So I realized a long time ago, I can't speak for the content of another diversity. I have to get that person, set up the conditions where that person can speak for themselves. And so in this collection, I got together people who represented both ethnic and cultural diversity and somatic diversity to speak their own voices and say, what does following a body-based practice mean from this, either from the standpoint of one's culture and indigenous people, and a Filipino woman, a person from the Caribbean, an autistic person, a fat activist. So all these people, to give them the opportunity to speak for themselves. So I think that's a really important piece of setting up structures where people from all the diversities in the culture can find a room to speak more clearly about what they can contribute or show it or whatever.
Thanks, Don. And it's helpful to hear just about one of the ways is empowering people of diverse bodies, of diverse backgrounds to have voice, and to have a space to be heard in that.
Which is another reason why working with language is so important.
Yeah, and just tying together kind of Christine's like lovely imagery about like how a neuron kind of like defines itself and forms itself, and there's different phases and stages, right? Like maybe first there's like finding who you are and finding which kind of who you are and where you're supposed to be and what your own kind of movement autonomy or whatever type you're supposed to be. And then there's the stage of reaching out, right? Kind of integrating, or kind of after you've got your distinctness, then finding the connection. And I think on the same level, just using that metaphor, Dawn, one of the things that you've done so well with that book is created a space where those kind of individual voices can be distinctified, right, and heard as their individual self, right? Kind of this notion of finding who you are and naming it for yourself or community, and then with the notion that, okay, that's an important stage to be in, to be through, and then maybe when there's enough support for seeing your distinctness, I like that word, kind of the distinctness, right? Then there can also be kind of reaching forward into that kind of integrative phase. Yeah.
I think it really speaks to here in the States how we're looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance. So, people will approach politicians. I think the first reference I have to it was with Hillary Clinton and her run for president. Someone said, "Do Black Lives Matter?" And she said, "All lives matter." And she just got hammered for that, because what happens is that if we don't say Black Lives Matter, we are suppressing a particular distinctive voice. We're suppressing a particular body narrative and of the stories of these particular people that haven't been told. And this is an area where distinctiveness and calling out something really that specific is so critically important in the States right now, and why we're trying to really push back against you know, something that sounds groovy. You know, it sounds really groovy to say all lives matter, but the point is that Black lives matter.
Great.
Yeah, no, that's so well put, because there is this counter narrative, right? That it's pushing against. It's not just a statement; it's a statement within a context that denies the truth of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's the importance. Like, okay, it's because of that background context that the statement needs to be made.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, so well put out.
Yeah.
I think it's also one of the areas where we have so much to offer at this point, because what I get interested in are these kinds of grippings that people have when they confront difference. And we're so used in our work to how to help people go in and find these grippings where they can let the other person in. And I think, Christine, I just want to name the fact that you represent such a huge and fabulous tradition of movement that, you know, goes all around the world. And I think the particular thing I want to put my finger on, in contrast to, say, psychoanalysis lying down on the couch, there's something about getting into movement and body movement that enables one to be more resilient in working with others. So, you know, things like contact improv and, you know, all of the whole modern dance tradition, you're constantly working with these minute sensings with each other. And that's very, very different from the psychoanalytic tradition in terms of offering something that's important. And so in diversity work, it seems really critical to work with that piece of it.
Yeah, they don't call them social movements for nothing.
Exactly, that's right, exactly.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. So there's some questions about accessibility. And I've seen people who are writing in and saying, you know, I'm in this part of the world and this isn't so accessible. There aren't a lot of therapists who are doing this. And so, you know, how does this become more accessible in a way?
Yeah, when you're in a location where accessibility is an issue, and that could be geographic, it could be socioeconomic, it oftentimes is socioeconomic, it could be racial and cultural, it could be gendered, the issue of sexuality, and accessibility, it leverages on a lot of different domains. And I think, you know, there's just no getting around it. You have to be a pioneer. You just have to become what is needed. And so where you are, how can you become what is needed? And that probably requires you to be a pioneer. It sort of harkens me back to one of my favorite moments in the movie, The Terminator. You know, in the first movie, I think her name's Sarah Connor, right? And she's this sort of meek little waitress who just lives to go to the bar on Friday nights. And this guy shows up and says, yeah, but you know what? You need to save the world. Sorry, but you have to save the world. And she goes, oh, holy crap, you know? And then by the second movie, you see her doing one-armed pull-ups, right? And she's become a warrior. And I think we all have to become what's needed.
But I think doing that is what the three of us have really done a lot, and Scott also, is how do we, the motivation of finding other people to join us and supporting those people and helping, like so many of the programs that came out of CIS, people went out and they started things which are very accessible to teenagers in trouble, to older adults. They did all kinds of movement works to carry on this thing. But I think the working together as a community of discourse like we're doing here is really important in creating a basis for carrying this, making it grow in efficacy.
No, I would just 100% agree with what both of you were saying, right? That kind of on some level, kind of when you're kind of, for whatever reason, kind of like outside of an environment kind of where you have easy access to this, you have to, on some level, kind of be that voice, be that warrior, right? And then kind of one of the exciting things that I think about what's happening in the world and what's happening like with this conference, with this summit, is that kind of accessibility can happen, right? Kind of, with the story of Sarah Connor, right? There's the person who is there kind of, and who wakes up, and there's the person who comes back to tell her, right? And so, there are people kind of in the world. And one of the things that I think we're trying to do is to kind of spread the word and say, hey, we need to save the world. We need to save the world on some level. Yeah.
I think this brings it to an interesting question is how might this, I don't want to just, the theme is around embodied psychology. So it's to me, it's bigger than psychology because we're able to talk about human connection and experience. But from this framework, how do we save the world?
Probably by not, probably through a lack of hubris, right?
Yeah, that's very good, Christine. Yeah, right. The last thing we need is hubris.
Yeah,
Agamemnon found that out the hard way.
Most academics do.
Yeah.
Why don't we start with how do we make change?
Okay.
Oh, boy. Well, I can just say from my own history of both positive things and regrets, that one of my regrets is that I did not take more opportunities to have conversations with people that I could have. Mm-hmm. So how important that is to weave people together. Mm-hmm. And it's more obvious than ever right now, where some people don't wear masks because they don't think they're not in trouble. Well, what about me? I'm in trouble. How about thinking about me, right? So how do we create more and more interwoven communities?
Mm-hmm. And I just want to say that's saying a lot, because Don has been one of the incredible pioneers of having people talking to different people and having people find their voices together. So that's saying a lot, what you just spoke of. Mm-hmm. I think, though, that one of the ways that we can understand the process of creating change is if we just look at the body and go back home, right? Go back home to the body and look at how does the body change? How do we actually take inspiration from our very biology and leverage that consciously to create really substantive and positive change processes? And so I did a lot of study actually in terms of anatomy and physiology to try to understand how does the body change itself. And of course, it's got a lot of different strategies to do that. But, we can take heart because a lot of change happens automatically. If you get a finger cut, one of the things you can almost guarantee is that it won't be there next week, because your body has understood how to work with it on just a very automatic level. And I think that we want to understand how the body operates around change. And I actually think there's 3 basic ways that we change. So one is through pressure. One is through a kind of Darwinian natural selection of, you're not going to change unless you're forced to. And that happens a lot. Let's say somebody close to you dies and you didn't ask for that. It was forced on you. That change, your whole life changes because of it. And you are pressured to change. Or you can come into therapy with, you say, listen, I just got out of an addiction treatment center. My recovery is very fragile. And if I don't change, my wife is going to leave me. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my driver's license. I'm going to lose everything, my house, everything. And so I'm feeling pressured to change. So pressure is one way that we understand change. A lot of what's happening in the US right now with social protests is creating pressure to affect change. And so that's one way of change. The other way, the second way, I think, is pleasure. We change through going towards pleasure. We change for saying, oh, you know, I'd like to feel better. I'd like to actually play more, find out what makes me happy, really enjoy the natural pleasures of things like conversation and a cup of coffee and looking out the window at the sky. And that impels change through novelty seeking also, which is also a very important resource for change. So pleasure is the second one. Third is inquiry. So third is that we just quiet ourselves and say, lay it on me. What emerges? What happens when I just get quiet and ask the questions? And how do I listen as a way to create change? And so for me, those three elements are how we create change, and they come from studying the anatomy and the physiology of the body. Sorry, long little spiel there.
Could I raise a difficult question for me? What about skill? So I think of people like Elliot Blackman, I think you both know, and Myron Rawford, I worked with for 50 years, and the Feldenkrais people, and so forth and so on. The skill of these people who have done this really carefully a long time is fabulous. They're not just integrating everything. They're really good at something. And I don't know where that's headed. It seems to me the profound development of precise skill, like the old craft model in traditional cultures, is, and it often gets psychologized. I think that's a problem of the intersection between what I would call somatics and somatic psychology, is that the skill of, say, the osteopaths gets psychologized. And so the person doesn't have the enormous skill of finding these pulses and working with the pulses. There's a little question.
Well, as an osteopath and a psychologist, I can say it takes a long time.
Oh, right. So you know the question.
I do know.
Yeah, to take on those two fields and get really skillful at both of them, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's really a lot. That's why I tend to work with collectives. I think it's collectives where you've got a lot of people who've done very specific things and are sharing. Like the Osho Clinic at UCSF, I think, is a really good model where you have a collaborative group of people in different modalities.
I think there's something really wise in that, Don, to say that not everyone has to be the utmost facilitator, being able to hold everything. That we can be able to focus in on particular sections or specialties. Is that what you mean? Like even within the field of psychology?
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly what I mean. Yeah.
Like some people might be more able to work closer with trauma, and some people with eating disorders, and some people with etc.
I'm also talking about different practices. So there are a whole range of movement practices, touch practices, psychotherapy practices. So there are different modalities.
Yeah.
I was talking more of that, actually.
Okay.
Developing skill in these different modalities.
Yeah. On some level, for me, it harkens back to the distinctness kind of non-duality kind of theme, right? How do we kind of preserve, like as we're evolving this kind of body of work, right? The distinct craft personship, right? Kind of involved in each of these arts, right? Which has its distinctness, right?
Exactly.
While also finding the ways in which it blends together. So, yeah. You know, I mean,
So perhaps just reading a few more questions, and we have about 20 more minutes or so, or this is moving quickly. So just some questions that are coming in from those who are here with us is kind of if we can name some of the pillars of embodied psychology, some of the key features that establish it or just make it a distinct process or practice in the social sciences, let's say.
Well, I came to this field with a big background in phenomenology, which was the science of subjectivity, really. To me, one of the differences is pretty much everybody in psychology now wants you to be mindful. Pay attention to your breathing, pay attention to your breath, pay attention to your feet. But intricacy is not there. Like I think the three of us have quite a feel for what it's like to feel our feet. There's an awful lot there that we have access to that could take a lifetime because there's so much there. So I think that to me, the development of somatic psychotherapy in the current climate is that we really take seriously what it means to pay attention to one's breathing. And like when my therapist, who's not a somatic psychologist, say, well, now where do you feel that in your breathing? I think, well, that could take me a few hours to kind of answer that question. There's just too much going on for me at this point in my life where I've gotten so used to all of those explorations. So to me, that's my first take, is that we take much more seriously the intricacies of embodied direct experience.
Yeah, I'll just throw out kind of a word that kind of, I think, gestures that kind of the same concept, but just like there's a foundational acknowledgement of the value of the felt sense, right? And all the intricacies that can occur, kind of just the universe that lives within just my breath, right? And a willingness to just listen to kind of the richness of that. So I think that's really kind of a foundational pillar that distinguishes and just the way we center that in our practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say if you look across a lot of modalities in our field, you'll see echoes, 4 echoes. You know, breathing for sure, moving for sure, sensing, and relating. Those are what I would call my 4 pillars. That all of those, the centrality of them as a lived experience and as a source of information that can be used towards not only our well-being, our healing, but our well-being and our creativity. I think is pretty across the whole umbrella, if you want to mix metaphors there.
Thank you.
I actually like to use the metaphor a lot of outdoor educators. It seems to me if you're going to be an outdoor educator versus just somebody who enjoys the wilderness, you have to learn a lot about weather patterns, how you build strength to carry a backpack, how to sort out food, how to understand the weather patterns in the wilderness. There are many, many, many things that you really take seriously that just going out for yourself for a day, you don't have to worry about.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that beautiful metaphor, and that's why it's important to go out into the wilderness time and time again on our own. That and on some level, that's how you learn the work. Right, by journeying out there again and again and again. Yeah.
I think that talks to the idea that just a continuation of this paradigm shift, especially in this form of psychology, of that each individual becomes the expert of their own journey, and that there's so much wonderful materials, each of your books, your classes, and all of these other people on these in these classes on the summit are great examples of incredible facilitators who have a expertise, but the expertise is also about supporting you to become the expert, which which I think I cherish so much as such a hallmark or a pillar of the philosophy embedded within this psychology.
And I'll just tag on that really quickly also. And I think that's why kind of the field of embodiment and embodied psychology has revolutionary potential, because, you know, it gives power back to the person in their lived body. Right. And it's easy. And I'll just borrow this kind of Ray Johnson. I was on we all know and love Ray. I was on a call with her, and they described how it's much easier to control people when we are disembodied. And if we are able to take back kind of our own sense experience, we can't be controlled. That there's an investment that people in maybe a military industrial complex may have, right, on keeping us kind of separate from ourselves, and that as we do this work, we can't be controlled. We are agents unto ourselves. We are autonomous unto ourselves. And that's why this work that we do is not just good for ourselves and makes us feel more whole, but it also gives us back power and can be an active, quiet revolution. Yeah.
I tend to use the term body authority in terms of what Albert's saying there, that we take back a sense of the authority of our bodies, and that is like a vaccination against things like oppression and suppression and social control, whether it's on the level of a one-on-one relationship, or a family, or a community, or a religion, or a society, or a nation, that there's that interplay that always has as its base that sense of bodily authority.
I think I just want to add one little note about diversity. It seems really important that we have one contribution, a very profound intellectual level, which is the ability to see the four of us. We are so different, the four of us, to learn, instead of thinking immediately like a lot of people are trained to do about, well, what's similar about all of us? To think, well, what differences are there between all of us? And there's something about developing sensing and movement awareness and all of that, which can give a very rich answer to realizing that we are all diverse, and then coming out of that to nurture people speaking out of their diversity, not being forced to talk like I do.
Well put.
Thank you, John. So I'd love to maybe, as a way of sort of landing the conversation for today, and would love to keep the conversation going for years, is kind of where is your focus? Where is your energy to next in terms of within this field? Essentially it comes back to the question of what excites you, what's driving you now as people who, again, as participants in this evolution of this field. I'd love to just land again with where are you headed next?
Well, I'm very excited about our new doctorate program, which starts in the fall. We have people from all over the world. It's because of COVID that we unfortunately don't get our face-to-face retreat, which used to ground the doctorate program. So now we're having to figure that out. But I'm very excited to work with people, very mature people who come to the program with a lot of chops and body practices, and now want to develop their writing, speaking skills, community organizing skills. And so that's a big, now that I'm having not been a licensed clinician, it was very difficult for me just to be in a highly regulated, board controlled program, but now I have freedom to kind of really do the whole 9 yards. So that's very exciting to me. And I'm very excited about being a grandfather.
Thank you. Albert?
Yeah, sure. Gosh, you know, I think venues like this, I think one of the things that kind of the internet kind of makes possible is spaces and scale of reach, which were unimaginable, right? 10 years ago. Like, we can reach people, and the technology of, like, as I sit with you, it feels like I can feel you on some level. Like, there's a real felt experience of being with you and together. And that's different, right? So the possibility of technology to, one, kind of spread kind of information, which is phenomenal, but also spread connection, right? To have those conversations, right? That, Don, you were talking about, to create like that inquiry, like where we can collectively feel each other's thoughts, kind of our own beings kind of just touch up against each other, and let that slowly transmute and transform something, even in this kind of space. Like, I feel like I've been made bigger or fuller or thicker or something. There's more of like there's something built physically here now for me. And this is now possible, and it's now possible on a larger scale than ever before, with greater possibilities for access than ever before. And that's exciting for me. It's kind of like we can kind of make ripples. Yeah.
I like that idea of ripples. I have to say that for me, I'm the kind of person who I've always had about 20 projects on my to-do list. I've always known where I'm going. I've always had, you know, the next book, the next article, the next research project, the next conference. I've scheduled my life so profoundly. And right now I'm just sort of appalled and amazed at how much I don't know, how I'm in a state of not knowing what's next. And that part of what COVID is doing to all of us now is creating an unknown, creating a, you know, we don't know what life is going to be like in a month. We literally don't know, you know, and here in the States, we don't know what the next 4 months are going to be like leading up to our next presidential election. And it's huge. It could be huge. And so I feel like there's some way, for the first time in my life, I'm having to study the embodied experience of being in the unknown. And so I have to say, I don't know what I'm going to do next. I really don't know. I don't know what to do with the unknowns yet. And also, like Don, because of COVID, we're taking care of my grandson 3 days a week. And so just being with a 4-year-old kid, you know, is amazing. Amazing and so embodied. Oh my God. It's so embodied. So that's all I know.
Thank you all. I think one of the things I appreciate most about each of you and the way that you talk is it could have been very academic. We all have the capacity to speak as though it only exists in sort of an academic field, but the way that each of you speak is a reiteration of our humanness, and that's so significant to be on the receiving end of the way that you speak, that we're talking about something, again, that could have been academic, that is studied, that is explored, but really it's about this humanness, this bodyfulness. And it is the way that you embody that and then speak from that is impactful. So I want to thank each of you so much for your inspiration, your clarity, and the impact on this field, because it is significant. So thank you, Christine Caldwell. Thank you, Albert Wong. Thank you, Don Johnson. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for coming and asking your beautiful questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but I am reading them. and we'll see if we can get to them in other panels or other talks. Thank you so much for being here. We will see you very soon.